it went off. There we go, okay. So let's kick off then. Good evening, dear members and friends. Welcome to today's event at the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft Rhein-Main. Today's event is actually the first since the summer break. So I hope you all had a good summer, and I'm pleased to welcome you back. In fact, we actually had another event, a kind of off-schedule event, a special event at the beginning of the month, where Nigel Longley, one of our members and Kassenprüfer, gave an excellent lecture on rowing in England, in particular the Henley Royal Regatta. And we had a very nice, it took place at Germania on the banks of the river. And we had a very nice picnic afterwards in the garden at Germania. So everyone who was there enjoyed it greatly. It was a pity that we didn't have more people who were able to come. So I'm delighted to welcome this evening's distinguished speaker, Professor John Davis, who will address us on the subject of royal or dynastic aspects of British-German relations. I think it's okay for us all to call him John. He's nodding, so that's okay. John, thank you very much indeed. John is Program Director of Heritage Management at the Historic Royal Palaces, which manages 6 royal sites, being the Tower of London, Kensington, Kew and Hampton Court Palaces, Banqueting House, and Hillsborough Castle and Gardens. John is also an honorary professor at Queen Mary University, London. John studied at Aberdeen, Glasgow, and Kiel universities. He also attended the Leibniz Institution of European History in Mainz and was a visiting fellow at St. John's College, Oxford. His research and publications cover a huge range of aspects of British-German relations, from economics, politics, and culture to modern history, including the history of exhibitions and, of course, heritage management. Would you like to take a seat? Right, and a few words on the talk, although I hope that all of you have had a chance to read the synopsis of the talk, which we circulated a couple of weeks ago. We all know about the close Germanic connections of the British royal family, especially the Hanoverian and Victorian dynastic links, and indeed their consequences in the 20th century. Many people are especially interested in the history of monarchy within the context of domestic politics and international relations, but there are many other fascinating aspects. This illustrated lecture, which we're about to hear, will focus on Germanic influences on the buildings and collections associated with British monarchy. As an aside from me, and very, very intriguing to me, the talk will also reveal that Germanic influence lasted up to a millennium or longer. So I'm very keen to hear about that particular aspect. The talk will seek to help us appreciate the importance of dynastic links for cultural transfer and exchange between the nations. It will also show how much Britain's tangible royal heritage today owes to the long and diverse British-German exchange in material culture. Before I hand over to our speaker, a word of thanks to Karin Zulski for suggesting this talk. Besides being an active member of the DBG Rhein-Main, Karin is also plays a senior role at the Prinz Albert Gesellschaft e.V. Coburg. So if any of you would like to know more about PAG Coburg, I'm sure Karin would be pleased to talk to you afterwards. I didn't okay with that with you in advance, but I hope it's okay, Karin. So, without further ado, John, the floor is yours.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me along tonight, and thanks for making time to come and listen to my talk, and thanks to all of you online as well who who have made the effort to log in. So I've been thinking about some sort of way into this because it's a very big subject. And I think I just will start off with myself to say, as Nicholas has just pointed out, I've been doing this for quite a long time. This week, for the first time, someone stood up and let me sit on their chair in the London Underground, and I saw that as a bit of a sort of moment in time when you realise that you've actually been knocking around for quite a long time. So yes, about 30 years of being a historian, and most of that time looking at British-German relations, British history, German history, in all sorts of ways, and you know, I always like to move through different subjects. So as Nicholas was saying, I've looked at political relations and economic relations and cultural relations. But I think probably from about 2011 onwards, 2015, I started to look at heritage, and in particular royal heritage. So together with Professor Franz Bosbach, who at the time was also leading the Prince Albert Society, we looked at the impact of the dynastic connections between Britain and Germany, and the collections today that exist at Windsor and at Coburg and at Gotha, and tried to work out what the sort of mutual connections were between those collections. So that was very interesting. But I was looking more and more at heritage. And then in 2018, a job came up at historic royal palaces. And that's when I shifted across from working at university, which by that point I'd been doing for 25 years, to working at HRP, Historic Royal Palaces. Now, you're probably sitting there thinking, what on earth is Historic Royal Palaces? Well, in a nutshell, it's a charity, a Stiftung, as it's often called in German, which looks after the unoccupied palaces. So there's a little bit of give and take, because Kensington Palace, which is one of ours, is still occupied, of course, or part of it is still occupied. But HRP is one of several organisations. And I was just admiring someone in our audience's Royal Estates bag. Yes, so the Royal Estates is another one. The Royal Collection is another one. The Royal Household is another one. They all manage different parts of royal heritage, and they work alongside each other. So HRP is looking after 6 royal palaces. One thing I would say about that is we work very closely with the other organisations, but when you come to Hampton Court or the Tower of London or Kensington Palace and you admire the fine furniture and paintings and jewellery and all sorts of things on display there, those actually are in the royal collection. So everything which is in the palaces is royal collection, and we are working with them. We're managing the buildings and the gardens and the sites. So anyway, I won't bore you with it. I find it very interesting. And an interesting part of my job is looking at the way all these different organisations work with each other, or don't, as the case may be. But anyway, when I started in 2018, which I was talking to Karen about this earlier, now seems like an age away, 2018, think of all the things that have happened since then. When I started in 2018, having spent a long time looking at British-German relations, I immediately wanted to know what German aspects are there in the palaces and collections. You know, what can I gather? So I essentially cast the net out to find out what connections there were with Germany in the royal palaces. And I'm part of a team of curators at historic royal palaces, about 15 to 20 people. And then you've got lots of other people working in conservation and interpretation and so forth. But I sent an email to them all and said, what can you tell me about aspects of Germany in your line of work? So this is where this paper, my talk tonight, began. It was really a sort of the end result of an information gathering exercise to find out what legacy the dynastic connection has left in the royal palaces and collections. So anyway, just before I move further on with the talk, I'm sure you've heard this before, but words can be very tricky. And several words in connection with my paper are very tricky indeed. So the word German, for example, is highly problematic historically. And so very often in my own research in the past, I've used the word Germanic as opposed to German, because it allows a certain amount of flexibility, and it allows you to talk about states and cultures and societies which are German today, possibly, or possibly not German today, but certainly were part of a kind of Germanic realm in the past. Now, you know, Germany doesn't have a monopoly on this because the Brits have that as well. So again, you know, when I'm going through my paper, at certain points I'm talking about Anglo-German relations. I really do mean Anglo-German relations when I'm saying that, because at a certain point in the past, England was different to Scotland and to Wales and to Northern and to Ireland as well. So I'm trying to be as specific as I can, but anyway, terminology can be a bit confusing. Yes? Yes, sorry, hello. Yeah. So, having said that, having given that rider, and I will move on to my next slide. So yes, my role is Director of Heritage Management at Historic Royal Palaces. These are some of the palaces that we manage. Top left, Hampton Court. Over on the right, Kew Palace. Bottom left is the Tower of London. And bottom right is the entrance to Kensington Palace. But alongside that, we've got Banqueting House, which you may know is on Whitehall, and is the only surviving part of the former Whitehall Palace, and is a fantastic building to visit. And also we manage Hillsborough Castle and Gardens, which is in Northern Ireland and is the seat of the Crown in Northern Ireland. So, and is a really excellent site to visit if you get time. So, the connections of English royalty with Germanic lands stretch back much longer than most people know. The arrival of Anglo-Saxon tribes in the British Isles after the 5th century is hard to trace, and there's a lot of debate about how it happened, but certainly large numbers of people were arriving from lowland areas that today would belong to Denmark and to northern Germany. The Tower of London, although begun under William the Conqueror after his invasion of 1066, incorporated walls within it built by the Romans against Germanic invaders, partly in order to protect the River Thames from people coming upstream. So here on this slide you can see the Roman walls against which the Tower of London was built. And if you visit the Tower of London today, you will see the Roman walls inside the tower. They're not immediately obvious, but they are explained as you go in. And certainly when you go outside the Tower of London, you'll find the city wall taking you past the Tower of London Underground station, which is essentially the Roman wall. Now, King Canute, who became King of England and Denmark in 1018, and as legend has it, tried to stop the sea coming in, sought to pacify his southern neighbours in the Holy Roman Empire by marrying his daughter Gunhilda of Denmark and England to the future King of Germany, Henry III. Gunhilda was also half-sister to both King Harold Harefoot and King Edward the Confessor of England, former king to King Harold. Gunhilda died young and she was buried at Limburg Abbey. The daughter of King Henry I of England, Matilda, married the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V in 1114 in grand ceremonies at the cathedrals in Mainz and Worms. She spent her childhood and youth in Germany and Italy. When Empress Matilda's husband died, she married a second time to Geoffrey Plantagenet, or the Duke of Anjou. When her father died, Henry I, Matilda's forces invaded England in 1139 in an attempt to have her crowned queen. Matilda was supported by many in England. This included Geoffrey Mandeville, the governor of the powerful Tower of London. Londoners rioted, however, when she attempted to have herself crowned queen at Westminster. In the end, and after frequent battles, it was Empress Matilda's son that was crowned king, Henry II, the first Plantagenet king. Now, Henry II is significant to the Tower of London, particularly because he massively expanded the fortifications around William the Conqueror's White Tower. So when you look at the Tower of London today, you've got the iconic White Tower in the middle, which is 1067, and then you've got we call them curtain walls, which surround the Tower of London. That is Henry II. However, Henry II is also well known for his disputes with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, partly because of his feeling of insecurity as a monarch and his possible feelings of guilt about, contrition around relations with Becket. He decided to draw closer to the Holy Roman Empire in the 1160s. He therefore arranged for the marriage of his daughter, also confusingly called Matilda, to Henry V, the Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, in 1168 at Minden Cathedral. With their court at Dankwarderode at Braunschweig, or Brunswick, Henry the Lion and Matilda went on to have 4 sons and 1 daughter. The sons included Duke Henry V of the Rhine-Palatinate, Duke Lothar of Bavaria, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, and William, Duke of Lüneburg, so very well connected into Germanic lands. This last connection is important. Duchess Matilda's links to the Dukes of Brunswick-Lüneburg made her an early link to the later Hanoverian dynasty. Duchess Matilda's brothers, she was one of 8 legitimate children, included King Richard I and his successor, King John, who may be known to you through the whole Robin Hood story. Richard famously spent a great deal of time in the Holy Lands, taking part in the Crusades, whilst his brother, John, plotted to take the crown. Richard was imprisoned, however, on his journey back in 1192 by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who had fallen out with Matilda's husband, Henry the Lion. Richard was held at Dürnstein Castle in Austria and at Trifels Castle in the Palatinate near Heidelberg. Has anyone been to Dürnstein? Yeah. Yes, okay. So it's a very interesting place to visit. And I think they reputedly show you the prison in which he was kept whilst he was at Dürnstein, but whether it's reality or not is...
I haven't seen that, but I have seen on many visits there thousands of tourists, so they go there in summer.
No, yeah, so...
But it's a lovely walk up to the ruins on the hill.
So, the other thing about this is essentially the Holy Roman Emperor was holding Richard to ransom, and in order to free Richard and allow him to return back to England, he demanded 3 times the annual income of the English crown, which was a huge sum and severely depleted the crown jewels in the Tower of London at the time. Richard was released after payment was made by Eleanor of Aquitaine, Matilda's mother. His brother John, meanwhile, apparently offered payment to keep Richard in Germany, but that wasn't accepted.
Excuse me, sir. Was not just the Deutsch-Britische, but later on to Trifels?
Yes, that's right. Yes, yeah.
So, sorry.
I did. I said that. I think I said that. Trifels near Heidelberg. That's right.
It's not near Heidelberg. It's not close to Heidelberg.
Oh, okay. It's
on the left side of the Rhine.
yes.
And it's in Valentinia area. And Heidelberg is on the other side.
Yes.
It was founded later.
Good. Okay.
Sorry.
No, I need to move on. So, when Richard I died in 1199, his brother John took the crown. John had 5 children, including Isabella. As part of arrangements between the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, Barbarossa, and King John, an attempt to recreate Christian unity and relaunch the Crusades, Isabella was married to Frederick II. Isabella and Frederick married at Worms Cathedral in 1235. Isabella of England, Holy Roman Empress, was also sister to King Henry III of England, who also undertook significant extensions to fortifications at the Tower of London. At Isabella's wedding, Frederick presented his brother-in-law Henry with 3 wild cats from his menagerie, apparently a reference to the 3 lions emblem of the Plantagenets. Henry brought them back to the Tower of London, where he built a home for them, and they survived till at least 1240. Other animals soon joined them, including lynxes, leopards, lions, and a bear from the King of Norway. The Tower of London's menagerie survived until the 19th century, by which time it had become a major tourist attraction. It was closed by the Duke of Wellington, who wanted the tower for military purposes. So, and what you have here on the slide is it's a sort of display which has been organised by Historic Royal Palaces to highlight the presence of the menagerie at the Tower of London and bring that to visitors' minds as one of the aspects of the tower's history. Amongst these early contacts, one should also perhaps mention Anne of Bohemia. The eldest daughter of Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, and Elizabeth of Pomerania, Anne came from a powerful family with a court at Prague. Her marriage to King Richard II of England took place at Westminster Abbey in 1382. She would be married for 12 years and is buried with Richard also at Westminster Abbey. Anne's crown was possibly made in Bohemia, although some accounts say it was possibly made in northern France, but certainly it was recorded as being in the crown jewels in the Tower of London in the 1390s. Later, it passed to German lands when English King Henry IV, who deposed Richard II, married his daughter Blanche to Ludwig, the son of King Rupert of the Wittelsbach family. Blanche wore the crown at her wedding at Cologne Cathedral in 1402. After this, it was kept at Heidelberg, where Ludwig became Elector Palatine. It's probably, as far as I'm concerned, the oldest surviving English royal crown. And today it can be found in Munich. So I suppose the point I'm making here is that it's not in one of the royal palaces, it's somewhere else for dynastic reasons. So there are also dynastic explanations for things which are not in the royal palaces as well as things which are. Also, it's worth noting just at this point that there are crown jewels older than the English crown jewels in Scotland. Very limited, but they're kept at Edinburgh Castle. Apart from the diplomats and courtiers who were involved in these dynastic connections, there's evidence of other types of Germanic contacts, particularly at the Tower of London. The Hanseatic merchants, for example, were recorded in London already in the 1280s. It was in the 15th century that the Hanseatic League would establish itself properly with the foundation of the so-called Steel Yard, Stahlhof, which is the image you can see on the top left. A free trading base for the Hanseatic League, which is now located somewhere beneath Cannon Street Station, right next door to the Tower of London, literally about 50 yards, well, 45 metres. If any of you are interested, there's a very lively nightclub there now called the Stahlhof. So if you fancy a dance on the Hanseatic legacy, that's the place to go when you're in London. But speaking to the curators, the building curators at the Tower of London, it turns out that of the many extensions which were happening at the Tower of London in the medieval period, a lot of the timber that was being used for the floors and roofs were brought in by the Hanseatic League and sourced through the Stahlhof. So, for example, in St. Thomas's Tower at the Tower of London, which is the image you can see top right, just to point out here that you might be thinking Tower of London isn't a palace. Well, it is a palace as well as a castle. And St. Thomas's Tower is where the royal residences were located and still are today if you visit. But anyway, the timber was coming through the Hanseatic League. Similarly, amber was discovered recently in research on the wall paintings in the Bywood Tower, which is the image that you can see here on the bottom right. This amber was almost certainly imported from the Eastern Baltic area by the Hanseatic League. The tower was also home to the Royal Mint in the medieval period. German coin makers were employed there, probably due to their expertise in this area. In 1489, under Henry VII, the first Tudor king, the first coin was produced with the value of £1 sterling, which is the image you have here on the slide. The new coin, called a sovereign, showed Henry's image, but also copied similar coins being produced on the continent. So this could be an example of cultural material transfer. It was produced by the leading German or Germanic engraver Alexander of Bruchsal near Karlsruhe. The sovereign has been judged as, and I'm quoting here, the best piece ever produced from the English mint, and Alexander as, quote, the father of English coin portraiture. He's listed as working at the tower from 1494 to 1509. Von Bruchsal was also a contact of Albrecht Dürer, so it's very interesting, these connections which begin to build up. German workers at the mint were present at least until the reign of Elizabeth I in the 1560s. The Reformation can be seen as a defining moment. I'm wondering whether it's the defining moment, but I think the Hanoverian connection is also important, as is the Victorian. But it's a defining moment in the British-German cultural relationship. The emergence of Protestantism and Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church over his marriage to Anne Boleyn in 1533 laid the foundation for close dynastic and cultural contacts for centuries to come. Henry's brief marriage to Anne of Cleves has been mentioned, and it was symptomatic of the new need to ally with Protestant rather than Catholic states. Another important development, however, was the arrival of the Renaissance in Northern Europe. The Italian influence made itself felt first outside Italy in the southern German states, producing figures such as Albrecht Dürer and then Lucas Cranach, and generally raising the standards of woodcuts and engravings and paintings. But this fashion quickly spread, including to England. Hans Holbein's journey to England and fantastically productive career in London rested on all these things. It also, however, resulted from the earlier contacts mentioned above. For Holbein's first trip to London involved working for the Hanseatic League and producing imposing murals for the League's steel yard, sadly destroyed. These striking murals in the steel yard clearly showed the influence of Italian artists such as Mantegna, whose work Holbein had probably seen in Italy. Holbein's steelyard paintings were named the triumphs of poverty and riches. Mantegna's, produced for the court at Mantua, were the triumphs of Caesar. And has anyone seen Mantegna's Triumphs of Caesar? Yes? They are on permanent display, apart from just at the moment when I think they're out on loan, at Hampton Court Palace, and are absolutely stunning, and were for 200 or 300 years seen as one of the pinnacles of artistic production, and hugely influential in all sorts of respects. So alongside possibly Raphael's cartoons, which were also at Hampton Court for a long time as well. Anyway, both through the Hanseatic League or through common contacts within the humanist circle that included Erasmus and Sir Thomas More, Holbein came to work eventually for Henry VIII's court. It's here that he produced his great number of stunningly realistic and revealing portraits. These were an important part of English courtly life and self-promotion. It was Holbein that was sent to paint women Henry VIII was interested in marrying. This included Anne of Cleves, who I've just mentioned. A marriage apparently not consummated, as Henry VIII found her repellent. Lots of different theories as to why he found her repellent, but anyway, it's pretty clear he did. Holbein also produced murals at Whitehall Palace and designs for decoration and silverware. Holbein's portraits are, however, an invaluable record of the court and personalities of Henry VIII, as well as other prominent London figures. His paintings of Henry defined his image at the time and today. They essentially created his brand. The Royal Collection, which I've just mentioned already, contains many of Holbein's paintings and copies of Holbein's drawings and originals and woodcuts and so forth, and they're to be found throughout London's royal palaces, which is one of the great strengths, I think, of the collection. Whilst on the subject, it's interesting to note one of Holbein's paintings of Nicholas Kratzer, now at the Louvre in Paris. Kratzer, who had studied at Munich and Wittenberg, was a friend of Holbein's and Thomas More's, and through the latter he became the astronomer royal to Henry VIII and spent most of his life in England. And I haven't got a picture of it here, but many of you possibly know it. Kratzer's possibly most, I would say, stunning, but also most high-profile work is the astronomical clock at Hampton Court Palace, which is still in operation today and is the most stunning piece of work in terms of craftsmanship and scientific knowledge and all sorts of other things. It's intriguing, however, also to observe a roundel today hung at Hampton Court Palace in the Haunted Gallery, because this roundel, using scientific analysis, and we do have laboratories at Hampton Court with specialists who are analysing the chemical makeup of the materials of collections, scientific analysis has revealed that the roundel was actually produced using stone sourced in Germany. Clearly, it was inspired by Florentine models. It's an image of Henry VIII, and it also seems to be based upon Holbein's painting of Henry VIII. But if you go outside the front of Hampton Court Palace, you'll see the roundels, one of which is depicted here on the bottom right of the slide, produced by Giovanni Maiano for Cardinal Wolsey, who was the original builder of Hampton Court Palace, who started Hampton Court Palace off. Maiano and Holbein worked together at Greenwich Palace, so there's evidence of direct links between the two. Maiano's career doesn't seem to have survived Wolsey's downfall, but Holbein, on the other hand, seems to have gone from strength to strength, and it's intriguing, it's interesting that he did do. His career continued to flourish, possibly due to his Protestantism, possibly due to his Germanic background. Who knows? Cardinal Wolsey also constructed what would become the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court. A central feature of this was the great stained glass window designed by woodcut artist and painter and friend of Dürer, Erhard Schön of Nuremberg. Sadly, and you can see a depiction of what the stained glass window possibly looked like, but sadly the stained glass window no longer exists. Here you have a picture of the Chapel Royal today. A rather odd perspective on this because it sort of makes it look like it's very small at the back, but at the back you have this reredos, which is essentially a product of Grinling Gibbons, and was produced for Queen Anne, and presumably it was decided that the stained glass window had to go, but certainly it's no longer there today. But nevertheless, there used to be a connection there. Meanwhile, also in the haunted gallery at Hampton Court, we've got the painting The Red Man, described by the Royal Collection Trust as one of the most enigmatic 16th century portraits in the Royal Collection. It's not really, no one really knows who this person is. Whether or not the painting is German in origin is much debated. It was actually acquired by Charles II in 1660 whilst on his Italian journeys, on the assumption that it depicted Henry VIII as a young man. And it certainly reminds us of the iconic pose of Henry VIII in Holbein's painting. But I don't know, others speculate it might be Edward VI, but Edward VI died at 15, so this looks like it's someone who is slightly older. And then again, the face almost looks like a Habsburg. So who knows?
With a big nose.
Sort of, yes. The 17th century, as you probably know, was a hugely turbulent time in England and, in fact, in the British Isles. It was a turbulent time in particular for the Royal Collection. Famously, most objects owned by the Crown, including the Crown jewels, were either sold off or melted down after the rise of Oliver Cromwell and the execution of Charles I outside today's banqueting house. Most objects now in the Royal Collection were therefore acquired after the restoration of monarchy under Charles II in 1660, including the Man in Red and Mantegna's triumphs. The return of the monarchy was widely celebrated, but there were also many people who found themselves having to rebuild good relations with the new king. This is the context for two significant Germanic objects in the crown jewels, which not many people will recognise as Germanic. The Plymouth Fountain and the Exeter Salt don't sound particularly Germanic, do they? But I've already mentioned the German metal workers at the Mint. Well into the 17th century, German silverware was in high demand in Britain. Both Henry VIII and Elizabeth I apparently had silverware of German origin at court. A community of silversmiths lived and worked in the city of London. The Plymouth Fountain was presented to Charles II by the city of Plymouth to replenish the crown jewels and to make amends for its previously rather republican sympathies. Today, part of the crown jewels at the Tower of London on display, the fountain with scenes of Neptune and originally spouting coloured flames and perfumed waters, was made in Hamburg. Not to be outdone, Plymouth's neighbouring port city, Exeter, presented Charles with a salt, also produced in Hamburg. This also remains on display at the Jewel House in the Tower and is traditionally used for coronation banquets. I'm not sure whether everyone can see the text on this. It doesn't matter too much, but what I wanted to demonstrate through this slide was another significant moment in this British-German narrative with the arrival of Hanoverian monarchs in a by now united British kingdom in 1714. When Queen Anne died that year, apparently I haven't counted them, so I'm saying apparently some 57 relatives were excluded from accession by their Catholicism, and the closest Protestant relative was George, Elector of Hanover. George's mother, Electress Sophia, was the granddaughter of James VI and First. Her mother, Elizabeth, James's daughter, married Elector Frederick V Palatine and moved to Heidelberg, later becoming the famous Winter Queen of Bohemia. By the time George I gained the British crown, he was 54, an old man in those days. When he arrived in London, he brought with him his son, the future George II, and daughter-in-law, the future Queen Caroline. Having divorced and imprisoned his wife, Sophia Dorothea, in the castle at Celle on the grounds of adultery, he also brought with him 2 German mistresses, soon nicknamed in Britain the Maypole and the Elephant. I'm not making this up. This was actually a high-profile Germanic takeover because alongside George, his family, his mistresses, came 3 German ministers. Remember, he was also Elector of Hanover at the same time as being King of Britain, as well as 70 staff. In 1698, the Palace of Whitehall burned down, leaving the banqueting house. St. James's Palace now became the main royal residence in the city. A German Lutheran chapel had already been set up at St. James's Palace by Queen Anne's husband, Prince George of Denmark, again showing this kind of mix of German-Danish influences going on. But it was now put to good use by the new arrivals. George I, German George, as he was often called, did not make much effort to get to know English or British culture. He refused to speak English and to appoint English staff, spent many summers back in Hanover, and when he was in London, dined and drank as if he was in Germany. Records of royal dinners at George's palaces show Wurst and Sauerkraut were served, and German beer was drunk. And I've got curatorial colleagues who've done all the research into the records of the green cloth, as it's called, to look into what was being ordered. A team of German cooks were provided with special new buildings, the so-called German kitchen at St. James's and another one at Hampton Court, designed by William Benson and Colin Campbell. And this is the image you've got here. I walk past this almost every day on the way to the office. For those, I don't know whether any of you have done this, and any of you online have done this, but if any of you are interested, it's now run by an organisation called the Landmark Trust. So if you fancy a nice upmarket weekend in a royal palace, go onto the Landmark Trust website and you can book yourself into the German kitchen for a stay, which, by the way, allows you into the gardens after hours and things like that. So it's a very pleasant experience. Anyway, archaeological evidence, and we're constantly doing archaeological digs around the royal palace, has also unearthed bottles of wine from the Rhine and from elsewhere. On the other hand, a notable feature at Herrenhausen in Hanover had been its impressive theatre and opera. As much of the building work at Hampton Court was, at Hampton Court Palace, George built a theatre in the Great Hall where Shakespeare had once performed. George also patronised the up-and-coming artist William Kent to paint the King's Staircase at Kensington Palace, showing members of the court that came to visit, other members of his court, including people who had been brought to Britain. This included, for example, on the left, George's trusted Turkish servants, Mustafa and Mohammed, who he had acquired whilst helping the Habsburgs defeat the Turks, and also, on the right, Peter the Wild Boy, an orphan boy apparently discovered by George while hunting in Hanover and brought to England. A famous example of George's patronage was, of course, Georg Friedrich Handel. Handel had already been employed in Hanover as Kapellmeister, but had left for London in 1711, perhaps because, like Holbein before him, there was more money to be made there. There are also, I'm sure this is, not true, but reports that he found Hanover dull and therefore wanted to move away. But anyway, when George I arrived in London, Handel found his way back into royal favour by composing his famous water music in 1717 for George I's trip upriver from Whitehall Palace. And the reason I'm showing you this picture, which is from an album cover, is because it actually clearly shows Whitehall Palace sitting on the river with the royal barges leaving it and heading upriver. Handel's career would continue to be connected with the Hanoverians. He composed Zadok the Priest for the coronation of George II in 1727, and it's been sung at every coronation since. Less obvious, but interesting, is the frequency with which German artists were used to paint members of the royal family. Foremost amongst them was Gottfried, Kneller, and Johann Zoffany, who arguably was Swiss rather than German, but this is where the Germanic word can possibly be used to good effect. Kneller, it might be said, was the Hanoverians' Holbein, and was being used in the same way that Holbein had been used to paint all the courtiers and leading people in the country. As I said, George I came to the throne at the advanced age of 54. From the start then, his son and daughter-in-law, after 1727, George II and Queen Caroline were also important German influences at the royal palaces. They made St. James's their home, and unlike George I, George II and Caroline were from the start part of the social world of London. At St. James's, George and Caroline held drawing rooms for polite society 4 times a week and also dined publicly there. They also had kitchens built for their German staff by John Vanbrugh. Caroline of Ansbach was by far the more intellectually and culturally engaged. She'd been brought up under the guardianship of Sophia Charlotta, the wife of King Frederick I of Prussia, and was influenced by her mother-in-law, Electress Sophia at Hanover. Like both women, she was a formidable intellect. She was a friend and patron of Leibniz and acted as a go-between between Leibniz and Sir Isaac Newton on scientific matters. She had a private library designed by William Kent at St. James's, one of the first libraries designed on a universal principle of organisation. She also showed just how enlightened she was by altering the library's layout to make space for George II's German principal mistress, Amalia von Walmoden, later Countess of Yarmouth. Meanwhile, at Kensington Palace, she demonstrated continental enlightenment credentials by creating a Wunderkabinett. And having discovered a large collection of drawings by Holbein, today in the Royal Collection, in a cupboard there, she framed and displayed them to show the links of the Hanoverian dynasty with the Tudors. Caroline employed Handel as music teacher for her children, here seen practicing in the little banqueting house at Hampton Court Palace. It's a rather nice painting. Caroline's collection can still be viewed at Kensington Palace today. Caroline was probably also inspired by the grand garden schemes she would have seen at Charlottenburg in Berlin and Herrenhausen in Hanover to create new impressive gardens at Kensington Palace. At Richmond, meanwhile, Caroline and Crown Prince George used Richmond Lodge as a summer residence when George I was still alive. They didn't get on, by the way. I mean, everyone knows that, but George I and George II loathed each other, and Caroline loathed George I as well. So they moved to Richmond Lodge. She leased the building there, which would later become Kew Palace, for her daughters to stay in when they were at Richmond. In the grounds between Richmond Lodge and Kew Palace, Queen Caroline began to transform the gardens. George and Caroline's eldest son, Frederick, Crown Prince Frederick, had been left in Hanover in 1714, but also arrived in Britain in 1728. So he was also essentially German or Germanic or Hanoverian. Brought up in Hanover in 1736, he married Augusta of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, deepening again the Germanic dimensions of the royal family. Augusta and Frederick were given the use of a building next to Kew Palace by William Kent. The Prince of Wales, Frederick's poor relations with his father, this is a Hanoverian trait, led to the ejection of both him and Augusta from all royal palaces. But this left a positive imprint in that the Waleses shifted their base to Kew. New kitchens were built at Kew Palace, where German staff were also put to work. Those can be visited today if you go to Kew Palace, very interesting site. Frederick also shipped in Meissen and Dresden chinaware upriver to Kew to continue Germanic dining traditions. Meanwhile, both Prince Frederick and his mother, Queen Caroline, now owning estates next to each other at Kew, entered into a sort of gardening war. Well, I think it was harmonious, but anyway, they were in competition with each other, with German Enlightenment romantic themes thrown in. Caroline built a grotto with the busts of English Helden, not unlike those found in German gardens, as well as elsewhere in England, admittedly, for example, in Alexander Pope's house. She created a pastoral elegy of shepherds and shepherdesses in the parklands around Richmond Lodge and held masques there. Prince Frederick brought antelope and other animals and introduced the chinoiserie, it's a wonderful English word, isn't it, into Kew Gardens with the Chinese summer house, a Confucian temple, the arch and the pagoda. From this point on, Princess Augusta took over. Augusta worked with leading botanists and architects, including the Swiss Alsatian Johann Heinrich Muntz, who worked on Horace Walpole's Strawberry Hill House to lay the foundations of what would later become the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. Augusta's eldest son became George III in 1760. Famously, George, quote, gloried in the name of Britain and was much less Germanic culturally. However, it's important to remember that the women in these monarchs' lives were a different matter. George's wife was Charlotta of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who would not only see him through periodic bouts of madness, in inverted commas, but also provide him with 15 children. Although, to be fair, he never took a mistress, which, is probably a relief, one would think. Buckingham Palace, which was bought by George III in 1761 as Buckingham House, was at first intended as a private residence for Charlotta in London and originally called the Queen's House. Quite a few of George and Charlotta's children married back into German courts. George III was particularly interested in Kew, where he began to breed farm animals, hence Farmer George. Charlotta, meanwhile, built her cottage in Kew Gardens. Another project was the gardens at Hampton Court, where he appointed Lancelot Capability Brown as head gardener. Brown was responsible for the planting of the Great Vine at Hampton Court in 1768. The type of the vine, anyone know? A black Hamburg.
It's written down there, but
Good.
it didn't mean anything to anybody.
Okay. The Germanic theme continued. George IV married Caroline of Brunswick. Their only child, Princess Charlotta, married Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Caroline was rejected by George IV and soon exiled herself to Italy. Princess Charlotta died in childbirth, leaving Leopold without a role until he was made King of the Belgians in 1831. But the last great wave of Germanic influence, and I'm on the home straight here, was, of course, Queen Victoria. And again, I'm showing you this. I'm not expecting you to spend too long looking at this family tree. But a point about Victoria, which I think is often overlooked, is that actually she was the last of the Hanoverians. She was a Hanoverian monarch, born, and then became a member of the Saxe-Coburg family by marriage. Victoria married her first cousin, Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Got some pictures here to show you of her, where she was born, and then her relations with Albert. And then I would just like to say that her children also married back into German royalty, including Alice, who married the Grand Duke of Hesse, Beatrice, who married Prince Henry of Battenberg, Helena, who married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, Arthur, who married Princess Louisa of Prussia, and Leopold, who married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont. So this is a fairly hefty German link in this next generation after Victoria. The large number of German relatives produced an enormous exchange of visitors and presents and correspondence. And again, one of the great assets of the Royal Collection are to be found in the Royal Archives, where you've got this extensive correspondence between all these German connections, much of which is in German. Yes. And I just wanted to point out one item, a noteworthy item here, which is a statue of William of Orange in front of Kensington Palace, presented to Queen Victoria by Kaiser Wilhelm II from his collection in Berlin. But this is just one of many examples at this level. Victoria and Albert maintained their strong interest in German culture, building libraries with German books at most of their palaces. Albert in particular was a gifted musician, and Mendelssohn was their guest several times at Buckingham Palace, where he and Albert played the organ together, and Mendelssohn played the piano whilst Victoria sang. Mendelssohn, in fact, said, quote, "The only real nice, comfortable house in England where one feels completely at home is Buckingham Palace." It's rather nice. The Germanic link may also have explained their fondness for Handel, who enjoyed a renaissance in the Victorian period. Victoria and Albert's many journeys to Germany led to a large number of artworks in the Royal Collection by Germans or about Germany. Prince Albert became a leading expert and collector of primitive German paintings and engravings, particularly of Lucas Cranach. A hugely significant development for the Royal Collection was Prince Albert's acquisition of the art collection of Prince Wallenstein. Albert had guaranteed a loan for his relative Ludwig von Oettingen-Wallenstein, and when he had to pay it off, received the collection of paintings in return. Some of these are at the National Gallery, others are now in store at Hampton Court Palace, others are on display around London's palaces. Albert also brought across the foremost German art historian, Gustav Wagen of the Berlin Museum, to catalogue the Wallenstein collection in 1854. That's one example of many other German members of Albert's staff who he brought across to work in the palaces on his collections. There's a picture of Oettingen Wallenstein. Victoria and Albert also reorganised the royal household. Part of this was opening up to the public the palaces which were no longer used. From 1838, Hampton Court, the Tower of London, Windsor Castle and Kensington Palace were all opened as tourist destinations. They became increasingly popular. An increasingly popular type of publication now emerged, travel literature. German visitors had provided accounts of London's royal palaces, at least from the 16th century. But now they ballooned in volume. They are an incredibly useful resource for curators today on how the palaces and collections looked in the past. Now London's royal palaces featured prominently as a destination for German as well as British travellers. Published accounts include works by Prince Pückler Muskau, Johann David Passavant, Fanny Lewald, and Gustav Wagen himself, voluminous accounts of collections in Britain in the 19th century.
What is that name again?
Gustav Wagen, W-A-A-G-E-N. Prince Albert also oversaw major architectural work at London's palaces. Much of this appeared to demonstrate his support for a revival of medieval architecture, though this was popular generally in Victorian Britain. Albert was central to the decisions about the interior decoration of the new Westminster Palace, which had been rebuilt in 1830 after a fire in 1834, and supported Gothicism and German-style murals there. He supported Gothic-style restoration at the Tower of London and at Windsor Castle. In this, he worked with leading Gothic castle builder Anthony Salvin, who had spent time in Germany in 1835 and had been influenced by what he saw there. In the field of castle building in the 19th century, the cross-cultural transfer is complex and mutual. In the 20th century, the German dimensions of London royal palaces became darker and at times shocking. Despite opening to the public, the Tower of London remained and remains today a military institution. During the First World War, it was used as a supply base by the military, and these are some of the images that you can see on the slide in front of you. It was also used, however, as a place to imprison German internees and prisoners of war. This role would recur in the Second World War, when the Tower of London took on a major role as a place for imprisoning German prisoners of war, mostly on a temporary basis before the prisoners would be relocated elsewhere. Prisoners included sailors and U-boat crews as well as air crew. They also included prominent figures, of course, like Rudolf Hess, the last state prisoner at the Tower. Interrogation of German prisoners also took place at the Tower of London. Meanwhile, the walls of the Tower of London are full of the graffiti of prisoners kept there over the centuries, and we're talking about 1,000 years of graffiti here, but it includes the graffiti by German prisoners kept during the Second World War. And one of the things that Historic Royal Palaces is doing today is research on the graffiti that's there, and also a lot of work in trying to make sure the graffiti remains accessible to the public and is explained to them.
Sorry, interrupting, but is that was a reverse swastika?
Yes.
And
Yep.
a hammer and a
Yeah.
yeah?
Yeah.
Is that Uncle Jack?
I don't know. I'm not. Yeah. The Tower of London had obviously, it's well known, had for centuries been the place of execution or outside the Tower of London, and many famous names met their end there, including Queens Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. But the tradition actually continued into the 20th century, if you can call it a tradition, with the execution of convicted German spies. 11 were executed during the First World War. Joseph Jacobs, a spy dropped in England and arrested, was the last person executed in the rifle range at the Tower in August 1941. And the chair in which he died is rather macabre, but to be found in the Royal Armouries Museum in the White Tower of the Tower of London on display. The image you see at the bottom is the rifle range where executions took place. It's no longer there, but when you go round the tower, there is a short explanation of what took place beneath you in the tower grounds. Meanwhile, both the Tower of London and Hampton Court were the targets of bombing during the Second World War. So, you know, this has also left an impact. Hampton Court Palace, Bushy Park and Home Park, being the grounds around it, were used for troop registration and processing during the Second World War. Eisenhower set up his European Command Centre there in Bushy Park. And it seems as if German prisoners of war were also processed in the parks around Hampton Court Palace. So it wasn't just the Tower of London, it was also elsewhere. There was widespread damage, but today we try and look at more creative ways of commemorating this aspect of the palace's past. One example of this, and I don't know if you have seen this already, was the poppies display, which took place in 2014 on the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War, which became an absolutely, was a phenomenon in terms of publicity, and it attracted, estimates vary, but around 50,000 visitors to come and see the poppies. The poppies were individually hand-produced at the same level as the number of lives lost during the First World War. And then once the display finished, many of them went to people who'd actually sponsored poppies. So they're actually found around the country now, and sometimes you walk into people's houses or into churches and you see a poppy on display there from the Tower of London. So it's a sort of interesting step forward, because in terms of heritage management, what now has become more important, especially post-pandemic, is increasing access to the palaces, not just on site, but remotely. And so in a way, this was quite a forward-thinking display in 2014, but also very iconic and much discussed at the time. So that's it. That was a very lengthy, comprehensive trot through the sort of Germanic dimensions of London's royal palaces. There's lots of things I've left out, you'll be amazed to know, but I'm happy to take questions, and thanks to everyone online. Yes, over to Nicholas, I think.
Please stay here, John.
Yep.
Yeah, so thank you very much indeed, John, for that very detailed, fascinating and entertaining romp, as I think you called it yourself,
yep.
a romp. I was aware of certain aspects of the what you said about the Hanoverians and Victoria. I didn't realise that there were links there were such strong links between the Hanoverians and the Victorian dynasty. I certainly didn't realise there were links between the Tudors and the Hanoverians. Did you say that?
Yeah, yes, earlier, even medieval period, yes.
Okay, fascinating stuff. So that was very enlightening for me. Right, should we start with questions from the physical audience? Questions from here? Yes, please. Sorry, wait a minute. I've got a microphone for you. There you go.
Hi. Excuse me, did I miss it? Or did you really mention Editha was first wife of Otto I in the 10th century? She was an Anglo-Saxon princess. I didn't know whether the lady is buried in Magdeburg along with her husband.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm not quite aware whether you mentioned.
I don't think I did, but
okay.
Yes, it's worth checking it. Yes.
So to be added to your next talk,
Yes,
right?
I mean there are more links there. Absolutely.
Yeah. Any more questions from the audience here? How about Michael? How about questions from the online audience?
So far, I have received none.
Okay. Well, so all questions were answered in that case. All subjects covered.
Well,
Is there any way that you can show me the online audience, Michel?
yeah, just a moment. Let's see. So there they are. Is there? Yeah. Well, do you see them?
No.
No.
We can see the poppies and a blank screen on the other side.
Okay. So actually, it should be on the right side. At least I see it. Probably it has to do with the with how they set up the image on this screen you are looking at.
Well, let's leave that. I was hoping to be able to see Professor Sheeran,
He's
to welcome him
there,
to our
yes,
community.
right. Just Professor Sheeran, say hello, and then
Thank
we
you
will
very
see
much for your
There he
warm
is.
welcome. Hello. I'm
Hello,
here,
we can
yes.
hear you very well. Ah, there
Thank you
you
very
are.
much.
Hello, Professor Sheeran.
You obviously know him very well.
No, we're meeting for the first time
Okay.
online, which is fantastic. But
Well,
we've corresponded.
Well, the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft Rhein-Main is very happy to have facilitated this,
Absolutely, yes.
this contact. Excellent. And thank you for becoming a member. In terms of becoming a member, thank you also to Lucy, who's sitting here at the front, who has again become a member, or has, no? Which is very good. Thank you for joining the fold. I'm surprised there are no more questions. There is a question, a detailed question from this man who questioned your knowledge about Richard the First.
Yes.
He's asking again.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Please use this.
So, thank you again. I have a question from medieval times, because what you explain is about the Germanic, and for me it's a question what you understand under the Germans.
Yes.
So maybe you point that out before I come, because it was a little bit too late. So I think there's a lot of dispute, because in the medieval times there is not a German Empire, it's a Holy Empire, which is something differently. And on the other side, I would give back the question to you, who are the English? Because if you see, I think until Richard the Second, they're all French. So they're Plantagenets, and they're fighting against French. The language was French. So when does I would say the English or British and German relationship really starts in your definition? Many thanks.
Well, John, you don't actually have to reply to that, do you? Because unfortunately, you did miss in the first minutes exactly those two topics, which John went into in some detail. But maybe you want to say another word about it?
Well, I think, so the question was just for people, I'm not sure if people online heard it, but was relating to the problematic nature of the terms German and English, particularly in the medieval period. I can only agree. I mean, it's highly problematic, and you're absolutely right. If you're looking at, certainly the monarchs in England in this period after 1066, then they are actually Dukes of Normandy, probably first and foremost, with all sorts of considerations relating to what's going on in France and what's going on in the Holy Roman Empire. I absolutely agree with you on that front. It's problematic. All I would say is, in my defence, if I could turn the lens round and say the focus of my talk was on the material culture of London's royal palaces. So that's what I was looking at, and that gives me some sort of ground on which I can stand in order to look at these things and say, well, these are Germanic influences coming in on the palaces and collections through the monarchs, who may be Dukes of Normandy or Holy Roman Empresses. But really what I was most interested in is, what Germanic aspects are there of the royal palaces and collections in London. So that was my leading question. But I also agree with you about the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, I think in a sense, I don't think even academic historians have grappled with these things enough. I've spent 30 years standing up at conferences and saying, do you mean England or do you mean Scotland? I'm defeated. It's and I think it's equally problematic with Germany, which existed as a state after 1871. And when I'm teaching undergraduate students about German history, I start off by saying to them, well, before 1871 there were 38 German states, and they look at me sort of, suspiciously. And I say to them, well, they were real states. They had governments, they had currencies, they had measurements, they had legal systems, they were real states. And they're beginning to get their heads around that. And then you say to them, well, actually, before 1806, there were about 300. And that really becomes a mind-blowing. But the question you then have is, well, what is a state in this period? I mean, things are so much more fluid. And if you look at the map of the Holy Roman Empire, very often, because it's based on legitimacy rather than ethnic identity or anything like that. So a monarch may own hundreds of little territories scattered around the Holy Roman Empire. It's highly problematic. All I can try and do personally is try and be as specific and as exact as I can at each point, and point out the complexity before I start. Yeah.
Any other questions from the floor? Yes. Sorry. Keep forgetting.
Thanks. Was this Germanic influence perceived as German before the 18th century, and is it still emphasized today as a German influence today?
It's a very good question. Yeah. I think the perception of Germany and Germanic really emerges alongside nationalism and rising national identity. So, and I would say from the Tudor period onwards, you've got a sort of rising sense of English nationhood. It didn't mean that people were identified as Germanic necessarily.
They were Welsh, weren't they, the Tudors?
Yes, well, yes, but I'm talking about in England at that time, isn't it?
Sorry.
Yes, yeah, you were absolutely right, though, to point that, and Irish as well. But there was a rising sense of English nationhood, which then meant people became more aware of other identities. But I think they would sometime, because Germany didn't exist yet, it would be more a matter of they're Bavarians, or they're from the Holy Roman Empire, or they're Austrians, or, so it would be different identities which were used. It's only really, I think, in the 18th century that German identity as some sort of homogeneous concept becomes more commonly used. And then in the 19th century, much more so. But even it doesn't really, it's really only after 1871 where you can say German. And even in the mid-19th century, people in Britain would be talking about Bavarians or Hanoverians or Saxons rather than Germans very often. If you look at the census records, which start off around 1801 in the UK, in England, if you look at census records and what people write down as the country of origin, it will often be Saxony or Bavaria or Thuringia, until later on in the 1850s and 60s when people start writing Germany. So, but it's messy. There's no system there, but it's a tendency which is growing, I think, in the 19th century.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Any more questions from the floor?
I have one, Nick.
Sorry,
I have a question put forward by Jochen Vieda. What is your opinion on the German-English relation today? Is the historic relation still present?
Oh, gosh.
Thank you for that question.
Yes. Well, yes. No, I'm sorry. I'm just thinking. I'm thinking about it, which I don't think works very well online. I think it does mean something, and if you talk to British people, they do know about the German connections of the royal family, for example, in the past, but it's not very widespread, and it's more of an academic discourse, I think, more than anything else. I'd leave it at that.
Okay, there's a question from two more questions. Just 1 second, sorry. This is a novel.
Thanks. My question is, have there been efforts after the World Wars to diminish the perception of said Germanic influence by the public?
Well, yes, I think I've done a lot of research on Victorian interest in Germany, and so during the long 19th century up until 1914, there was a fascination with German culture, and I'm using the word German again, I know it's highly problematic, but a fascination with it in terms of religion and literature and science and industry and music and so on. So that lots of areas, lots of departments, if you like, of British life were talking about German culture and very interested in it. And you also had a strong German migration movement into Victorian Britain. So apart from the Irish, and this is, you know, the Germans were the largest foreign community in Victorian Britain. And again, it's highly contested because they would not necessarily describe themselves as Germans, and many of them were German Jewish, which was another complicating factor there, but certainly they were a very large presence in British cities in the 19th century. But 1914 is a real caesura, I think, and it's a deep kind of wound, if you like, which is inflicted on this. And interestingly, I don't think it's almost like there is a kind of recoiling from this after the First World War. So you find many of those interest groups that were interested in German culture prior to the First World War, which were sort of clamped down on during the First World War, in the 1920s become interested again. But I think it peters out in the 1930s and people become less interested in these cultural aspects. But it does leave a legacy. So this idea of Germany being the land of music, for example, that lasts till today. I mean, that's still there very much so. German science and the legacy, you know, the admiration for German scientific advances under people like Liebig in the 19th century. I mean, that's still there as well. And the whole thing about Vorsprung durch Technik, the reason why that's been such a successful advertising moniker in English-speaking worlds is because it rests on this 19th century reputation for technological advance. So it's still there, but I don't think the kind of, you know, this real sort of Germanophilia was there after the 1930s.
Thank you, John. We have one more question from here.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, from the
I would like to take an issue with the backlash from the British public. Didn't that become an issue when Princess Diana wanted to buy a cutting-edge Mercedes and was denied it by the Queen?
I really don't know. I'm just not sure, but it's very interesting, yeah. But it's interesting that these top German models are still seen as, you know, kind of objects of acquisition and admiration. So, yes.
Right, I think we'll call an end to the Q&A there. I'd like everybody to give John another round of applause for his excellent talk.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for holding with me, and everyone online as well for staying the course.
So thank you also to to Karin Zulski again for bringing us all together. Thank you for the physical audience for attending. Thank you to the online audience for attending. I've only got one housekeeping item this evening, and that is to tell you about the next event, which is a lecture on the English Channel Islands on the 31st of October. Which I think could be quite entertaining. A rather different topic from today's topic.
Well, Duchy of Normandy is kind of still
okay, there. No, okay, yes, absolutely right. So, thanks very much indeed.